Welcome, welcome. Going to give everyone about 2 minutes to arrive in the room. We started a minute early, so we'll give everyone some more time. Hello, Maria. Hello, Sophia. Welcome, welcome. All right, and since we're recording and as people continue to come in, I will go ahead and get started right at 4 o'clock, understanding that lots of folks will continue to hop in over the next couple of minutes. And I'll just appreciate everyone bearing with me. Last week for our webinar, I was sick and so probably a little low energy. And this week I've had jaw surgery or a jaw procedure. And so I think I'm speaking okay, but I have kind of some swelling in my face. So bear with me, please. All right, it is 4 o'clock. Let's get started. Welcome to the seventh and final iteration of our Pivoting to Digital Organizing series. My name is Aaron, I'm with Texas Counts, and I am joined by Katie Martin-Lightfoot and Robin Paoli, and we are most, but not all, of the communications team of Texas Counts. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. Just a couple of notes about today's webinar is it is a recap of everything that we've covered in parts 1 through 6 of our Pivoting to Digital Organizing series, or rather I should say that it is a recap of most of what we've covered. And we're going to do a couple of things today. Including just do some polling. So even if you haven't been a part of the previous webinars that we've done, then we just kind of want to do a pulse check on how well people feel they're doing in the pivot to digital organizing, and some questions specific to kind of what you're planning over the next couple of months. Today we are basically going to plan our own virtual event from start to finish. And so it will move very quickly, but this is being recorded for your future reference. And on top of that, I'll say that we are going to wrap up this particular series, which is, just something that we planned very quickly, very swiftly in response to the fact that we were all of a sudden in the middle of a pandemic and shelter-in-place orders, and we were trying to help you all quickly adjust, considering you had so many live events planned for the spring and into the summer. But as we know, a lot of life and a lot of the census has changed over the last couple of weeks and months. And so we think that this is probably a good natural ending to this particular webinar series, but this certainly is not the end of training and webinar resources from Texas Counts. And so we'll ask you to kind of stay tuned. In addition to our weekly update, we are planning a series called the Virtual Road Trip, which is something that we would encourage participation in. Starting on Monday, we'll kind of solicit local partners and start to get your feedback on how you might join in on our virtual road trip, which will start in early June. So let's get started today. I'm going to hold off on the poll because I want to see if we can get a couple more people to roll in. It looks like we only have a handful of those who signed up here today. And so I will myself very quickly pivot to jumping back into just some of the themes that guided our discussion at the beginning of this webinar series. So early on, we decided we wanted to focus on not so much how we were going to communicate with people, but really what it is that we wanted to say. And so we still think that, now is the time to continue kind of communicating in this kind of crisis mode and making sure that, at the end of the day, we're all kind of servicing and we're all serving a particular community, a particular geographical area or an affinity group. And so we just want to make sure that we don't lose the relational aspect of that. And so even though we are all very concerned about the census and we're all very passionate about the census, we think it's appropriate to hold some space for people to just kind of let you know how they're doing in this still, especially as, different parts of the state and different sectors are kind of opening up along different timelines. We just want to make sure that it's not, kind of lost in our messaging that we're still in the middle of a pandemic and that people are kind of affected differently. Some people are affected disproportionately. And so we don't want to lose that in our messaging. on the a different side of the same token, we understand that a lot of people are experiencing kind of COVID fatigue, and that they don't want to spend a lot of time thinking or talking about it any more than they have to. And so we just understand that now is the time to be a little sensitive about what kind of messaging we're doing. And the reason I include this slide again from our very first session is because we got caught up in this kind of social media and live event kind of rabbit hole, which is still very valuable, but we don't think it's too late to start thinking about other ideas for outreach as you're kind of gradually planning maybe some live events later on in the year. And now, you know, if you've been doing some more social media, or if you've been doing more virtual events, then your assets may have grown, right? So in this time, in these last 8 weeks, then perhaps you started a newsletter. And so you may have more email addresses. And we'll talk just a little bit today, but not too terribly much, about how you can leverage those email lists for some social marketing. If you've held something like a live Zoom, and we're gonna plan together a virtual Ask Me Anything today, then know that you can always go retrieve the registrations for that and build your email list that way. Your social media presence has probably grown. You probably have more likes and followers now than you did, more than you did about 8 weeks ago. And we still don't wanna lose focus on the fact that you know, you'll have more bandwidth over the next couple of weeks as school is no longer in session. And of course, educators have been highly focused and around kind of delivering virtual instruction and making their own pivot. But educators are still a very powerful audience and can amplify your message greatly. And so you want to stay in touch with any educators you have contact with well into the summer. I still believe in the power of neighborhood associations, and we're going to talk just a little bit again about how you might leverage neighborhood associations, but we kind of lost our focus on that. And then, of course, social groups and networks. We still think it's time to think about who exactly your audience is. So it could be both, and you could have a lot of overlap here, but we're gonna focus mostly today on this kind of geographical targeting over affinity group targeting. So I would encourage you to go back and visit our part 2 that we had, or our part 4. Part 2 was about Facebook and kind of using the power of groups, and part 4 was about Nextdoor. And in Nextdoor, there's a couple of affinity groups that you might find in your very own neighborhood that you weren't aware of, where you can just kind of keep that steady drumbeat of messaging around the census going. And then we talked about this early on, haven't really revisited it, but the idea of outreach versus broadcasting. And so broadcasting is just putting the information out there, right? And so we're going to do a little bit of both today. We're going to come up with an event and we're going to put it out there for our existing kind of audience. Outreach for us is really going in and trying to draw more people into the fold, engaging them around our virtual event or around our message who may not otherwise be in our orbit. We can just ignore this power of the personal touch thing. I mean, I think that's all pretty obvious to us. And then this is also kind of different from 8 weeks ago, is the idea of cutting through the noise. So I do think that even though we're still in the midst of a pandemic, that we're not in crisis mode as much anymore, where there's so much uncertainty. I know that this is very different all across the state, but I live in Houston and in Harris County, and in Houston and Harris County right now, it's very easy to go get tested. You call a number at, you know, any time between 7 a.m. or rather 9 a.m. and 7 p.m. and you get an identification number, and you can go to a free testing site and you get your results in 2 days. And so I think that, you know, the kind of environment that we're in right now and how we have to message to kind of cut through the noise of the pandemic is a little different than it was 8 weeks ago. So as we continue as we continue kind of getting a little pulse check on how well we've all done over the last couple of weeks, I'm going to start a little poll right now. And I'm going to ask Robin and Katie to confirm either by chat or something to let me know that the poll is up, or I'll see if you start voting. But let's just look at these 3 questions right now all together. One, now that Texas is gradually reopening, for how long do you see yourself continuing a primarily virtual event-focused strategy? So remember that our kind of idea in starting this series was to kind kind of give you something to do instead of your live events that you had planned. You'll see the options there, but I'm just kind of staggering them the way I think that we may be thinking. I know most of us didn't know what our life was going to look like 30 days ago, and so it's thinking in these 30 and 60-day chunks is probably daunting enough. The other question is, have you had any virtual events since mid-March? And if you have, kind of give us a feel for how many you've had. I think it's perfectly reasonable if you've only really had time for maybe one or two. Which of the following, which of the tools we've covered in this series have you utilized? Facebook, Instagram, Nextdoor, Zoom, or the Reach texting app? We've spent less time out of those 5 talking about the Reach texting app, though I did kind of give some examples of how to use that in our very first webinar and in our Census Day events. And then 4, have you done any Facebook advertising since mid-March? The reason I asked specifically about Facebook advertising is because it's easy in some respects, but it's also pretty complicated. And so I know that as we plan our virtual road trip, and that's probably something that we as a campaign, as the Texas Counts campaign, will revisit, is Facebook advertising. And so we thought it was a good time to just kind of get a feel for you as our audience, whether you have some experience with it, because we'll definitely be spending some more time thinking about that as a campaign. And we would probably be happy to provide additional training specifically around Facebook advertising, though that was the focus of our 3rd webinar. I don't expect you to keep track of all of these numbers of webinar 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Just know that if you go to the Texas Counts website and go to our communications toolkit, you'll find an easy link to a YouTube playlist that has all of our trainings on it. We put the latest training on the homepage of the website, or you could just go to YouTube and find the Texas Counts YouTube channel, and you will see that we have all of these and all of our weekly updates organized into one YouTube playlist. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up for about 45 more seconds and just start to read through some of the results. So it looks like, for the most part, we anticipate having to plan a couple more virtual events through the summertime. Of course, we would have never thought that we would be having any census-related events past July 31st up until a couple of weeks ago, whenever it became apparent that we were going to extend the timeline of the census, and so that makes sense. How many virtual events have you had since mid-March? Very few of us have had none, but that's fine, because no matter where you are, I think the tips that we cover today will be pretty useful, but this is very good information for us to have. Still, Facebook is a very popular tool, very powerful tool, and so it looks like the vast majority of us are using Facebook, and then after that, Instagram and Zoom. We're going to cover Facebook and Zoom in a kind of real life scenario today, and so I'm happy to know that many of you have some experience with that. Have you done any Facebook advertising? It looks like the vast majority of us have done one or none of any Facebook advertising since mid-March. So thank you so much for all of these responses. Very, very helpful. Almost all of us have voted, but I think I have a pretty good feel for what's going on here. So let's dive right back in. So I'll leave the poll open, no reason to close it as I go through our very first slides. So what we're gonna do today is we are going to plan our very own Facebook Live event, and this is going to be a virtual Ask Me Anything. So to kind of revisit some of the event types that we discussed last week, whenever we were talking about different ways you can go live, this was at the top of our list at least, and that was a very easy event to design, is an Ask Me Anything about the census. I think the biggest challenge whenever it comes to having one of these Ask Me Anythings about the census or about anything else is getting your audience to actually show up with questions. And just, I really think that's a numbers game. There are lots of people who show up wanting information, but don't necessarily know what questions are at the top of their mind. And so we're gonna get ahead of that a little bit by planning a virtual Ask Me Anything for, let's just call it 2 weeks out, or let's say a week out. And then we're going to advertise it a little bit and then start to kind of give people some leading questions. And we're going to use data from the CUNY Hard to Count map for that. you can have a traditional educational webinar where you want to present around a certain topic. So early on in census outreach, some organizations like NALEO, right before the invitation to self-respond went out, then they were doing kind of these walk you through the census questionnaire form and kind of giving you some step-by-step guidance on what certain questions mean and kind of how where people tend to hit snags in coming up with their responses to certain questions on the census questionnaire. And so, you know, that's a good one. Or, you know, let's say you're still in a point where you want to empower a lot of people at the kind of block by block level or, you know, in the neighborhood level, then you may hold something like what we've done with these pivoting to digital webinars and instruct people on how to use the CUNY Hard to Count map or how to use something like Nextdoor. And what we're about to do is precisely this. We're going to walk through the self-response data so that our Ask Me Anything can also have a little bit of a challenge element to it. And so this is something you'll see whenever we embark upon the Texas Counts virtual road trip, is that we're going to have response challenges. The Census Bureau has noticed that those are very impactful, and we've seen a couple of organizations do it really well. So we will dig into that. So we're going to spend it looking at the CUNY Hard to Count map, and we're going to look at it specifically for the design of our virtual Ask Me Anything that we're planning here today. So I know many of you are very familiar with this tool, and so we're going to kind of, for the purposes of going top to bottom, then we're going to use it right now, but I would highly encourage you to go look at any of the great training resources that are out there for this map. I would encourage you to kind of see the map in action every Monday at noon. Dr. Lila Valencia with the Texas Demographic Center does a pretty deep dive into certain counties around Texas, and she has also introduced a new tool that we want to start promoting very soon, and it's it's a data dashboard coming out from the Texas Demographic Center. But for right now, I really want to, I think the theme today is kind of hyper-local, and so I want to show us, you know, just quite how hyper-local we can be whenever it comes to using the CUNY Hard to Count map. So what I'm going to do right now is change the drop down on the left-hand side to tracts, and then I'm going to do the search by on the upper right-hand side to census tract. Because what I really want to do is zoom into my neighborhood. So for the purposes of today's example, then what we're going to do is we're going to focus on a very hyperlocal Ask Me Anything just for my neighborhood. And so, as I mentioned, I'm in Houston and Harris County, and so we're just going to keep drilling down more and more and more. And just to kind of pick back up on some of the broader themes of census outreach this year, then we know that people trust these hyper-local trusted messengers. And so I will say that one of the reasons I want to focus an event in my neighborhood is because, you know, I'm the editor of the newsletter for the Houston Heights, and, you know, we're having a bike rally, a virtual bike rally in a couple of weeks, and there's like a video with me in it and everything like that. And so you could call me a trusted messenger in my neighborhood. And so I am going to design an event, even though my neighborhood of the Houston Heights, which is, I don't think you can see where my cursor is at this point, but we are pretty good whenever it comes to self-response. So if I look particularly in my little neck of the woods, we are in the 50 to 56% self-response rate. It's good, it's not great. It is above the Texas average, but it is not quite the national average. And so I'm looking at this kind of quadrant that says south of 11th Street, north of 4th Street. But I want to have a little virtual Ask Me Anything that is basically going to be targeted to this area. This neighborhood happens to be called the Houston Heights. And I'm looking at this right now because I want to be able to give people data on exactly how our self-response is doing. And I want to challenge my neighbors that, let's just say by the end of this month, I want to be above 60%. So in my particular corner, we're at 54.6% as I clicked on tract 104 in Harris County. Then you can see that on the left-hand side, it's a little faint. It's a very light blue. But as of 5/7/2020, we're at 54.6 self-response compared to our 2010 final self-response rate of 71%. And so those are some numbers that I'm going to want to keep in mind, because part of being a trusted messenger is letting people know that you're focused on their particular neighborhood, and you have, you've done the homework and you have the data that is specific to them. Let's click on over a little bit to the west and take a look at my western Houston Heights neighbors. And this is tract 5105 in Harris County, and they have a 56.2% response rate compared to 68%. So we did a little better than them in 2010, but they're doing a little better than us in 2020. Gonna click just north of that and look at tract 5113, and they're at 59.5%. So they're kind of the shining stars here in this neighborhood. Actually, I bet the one just to the east is higher. They had a 73.7% self-response rate in 2010. And no, actually they're doing better. So this is kind of Houston Heights Northwest. And there's some interesting things that I could probably tell you about the neighborhood that I think this would all kind of make sense, but we don't have time for that today. We just want to get the numbers. So what I'm going to do is, with this data, I'm going to tell the neighbors in this Houston Heights, area, hey, we had about a 70% self-response rate in 2010. Today, we sit anywhere from 56 to 58.5% or 58.8%. How can we exceed our numbers in 2020? Can we get to, let's call it 65% by the end of May? That's going to be like the call to action. That's going to be one of the messages that I have for my neighbors in the Houston Heights. And I hope that we can reach that number, but we're gonna kind of position it as, why do you think that we're not at this number? And what can we do to get to this number by the end of the month? Ask me anything about the census when it comes to self-response or non-response follow-up or the timeline of the census. So I'm gonna just kind of take these numbers, keep them in my back pocket for now, and I'm going to get started on planning my event. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna hop into Zoom very quickly, just for purposes of demonstration, because this is something that we covered kind of in the abstract, and I had a little video that I showed us last week, which is also linked in this week's slideshow that you'll get, about going and making sure that you are enabled to have webinars, or rather Facebook live streamed webinars and YouTube live streamed webinars. And so I'll send you back to that, but that's also linked in this slide too. But because I want to make this kind of ask me anything, we're going to go for the webinar over the meeting setting. And I am just going to create my webinar. Oh, I have so many Zoom accounts, and I happen to pick the one that doesn't have the webinar thing, but I was just going to show us kind of where these things are anyway. And so I'm going to come in and I'm going to schedule my webinar for my Ask Me Anything. There's really no reason that I couldn't do this as a meeting too. The only thing about scheduling it as a meeting is we can stream both to Facebook, which is ultimately what we're going to do for the kind of live Ask Me Anything portion of our event. There's no reason that it can't be a meeting, except that sometimes you just can't control exactly which view people are seeing if they're watching on Zoom. So since most of you, as I saw from our poll, have some experience with Zoom, then just kind of want to gloss right over this. But I would start my webinar, and then whenever it comes time to stream live to Facebook, then I'll refer you back to our little video. But just as a general set of steps, I've used my CUNY hard to count map, and I've kind of brainstormed a little bit to know that this is going to be a virtual Ask Me Anything, where I'm going to provide my neighbors some self-response data, and I know I want to challenge them. And so I would come into Zoom and I would create my event. This would also be a lovely time to go and kind of leverage any email lists that I have and email it out, just so that people can kind of pre-register and invite them to send in some questions. But what I would do after that is with my Zoom link, then I would go into my Facebook page. And since most of you have Facebook pages, we know from our past webinars, and our part 2 was about going and kind of optimizing your Facebook page so that people can see that you're a credible and resourceful person in the census, or organization in the census. And now we're going to go ahead and schedule the event in Facebook. So I'm going to pause just in case you weren't with us last week and talk about why would we create an event both in Zoom and in Facebook. And it's precisely because, you know, whenever it comes to Zoom, you're really limited in how you can broadcast that event and have people sign up for it on your email list or on what kind of traffic you get to your website if you're promoting it on your website. We're going to use Facebook, one, because almost all of us have a bigger following on Facebook than we have either daily traffic to our site or subscribers to our email list. And so we want to have an event, not only so that people who like our page can find it, but also so that we can run ads on it, and so that we can encourage any partners we have, whether they're local partners, some of those neighborhood associations I'm so crazy about, you know, any complete count committees that are in our fold. So no matter who you are, we want to make sure that we design and give ourselves enough time to promote an event that we can leverage kind of the full breadth of features on Facebook for promoting an event, including advertising. So I'm going to go and create this event right now. And just know that because this is from the Texas Counts Facebook page, we're not actually going to make this live or run any ads. I'm going to have it up, you know, very quickly so that we can talk about some of the advertising aspects of this, but it's going to come right down. So don't plan on coming to this virtual Ask Me Anything. Most of us are pretty familiar with this, but this is our kind of new event screen whenever we are at our page and start a new Facebook event. I had already kind of created us a little graphic that we could use for these purposes. And I did create this graphic just in case. I didn't brand it too heavily to Texas Counts. There's no Texas Counts logo or anything like that. So that just in case you're so excited after this webinar that you want to go and do this exact same thing, then you have this image readily available. But it's kind of optimized for a Facebook event cover because the information is kind of squished right into the middle. They like a lot of space, negative space on the sides and on the top. But this is an Ask Me Anything about the 2020 census. And I would just from the very get-go, because we want to have a hyper-local focus, I would say virtual, or rather, I think people get that it's virtual, live, ask us anything about the census, Houston Heights Challenge. Oops, let's just say Heights Challenge. And we will just put this in as my neighborhood again for these purposes of demonstration. We're not going to waste too much time here coming up with a description or anything like that. But again, what I would put if I was really focused on this event or really designing this event is, again, I would drop in some of those numbers. Hey, Heights neighbors, knowing that we're going to end up targeting these people through advertising. And so while we may get some people who are, you know, outside of this neighborhood or something like that, I know this is all really higgledy-piggledy because I'm doing it from the Texas Counts page and this doesn't quite make sense. But just kind of think about who your audience would be or what your, you know, geographic area would be, and kind of how you would message that if it's coming from a campaign page for maybe a complete count committee that covers a larger area than you're kind of targeting with this event. And I would call out some of that specific data. Did you know that in 2010, we had over 70% self-response to the US Census, but in 2020, we're lagging far behind. You know, most parts of the neighborhood sit somewhere between 56 and 58%. How can we not only meet, but exceed that number that we got to in 2010, especially because it's easier than ever to respond to the census by phone or online, yada, yada, yada. All of you are very familiar with kind of the basic messaging around the census and self-response. I would go ahead and just call this a cause. And I would make this probably a one-time event for the most part. Let's just say for the purposes of demonstration, I want to do this next Friday. And I'm going to do it at about noon. And I don't know that anybody's kind of has a hankering to do a longer than 1 hour event of quite this type. But we find, just with these webinars, with the Texas Counts Weekly Update, and just kind of watching some of the other events that are happening, we'll kind of follow this model too for the Texas Counts virtual road trip, is that it's probably not setting yourself up for success to have an event that's stretched out over 3 hours and expect people to kind of come on board the whole time or stay engaged the whole time. We think an hour or even less than an hour is perfectly fine for something like this. Now, I want to focus a little bit on this co-host thing because this is one of the ways that you can really expand your reach. So, let's just say that I was a complete count committee for my neighborhood of the Heights. Then who are some of the people who I might want to invite along this event? And in this scenario, I'm not Texas Counts. I'm a complete count committee for my broader neighborhood or my part of Houston. Then I would want to think right now, and this would probably require a little bit of kind of outreach beforehand, but one of the ways that you can, with outspending a dime before you even really get to the part of promoting your event or advertising for your event, is you can amplify your reach by going and inviting co-hosts to your event. So I would think about the neighborhood association. I would think about the precinct 1 constable, Alan Rosen. I would think about the Greater Heights super neighborhood. And all of this is going to be very, very kind of particular to who you want to target. Just remember that right now what we're doing is basically geographical targeting, and we're just going to call out the name of the neighborhood to try to get people to engage with it more, feel like it applies to them. But this is a perfect way to make sure that your event gets shared out far and wide is by the types of co-hosts you invite, right? You can always aim really high and maybe, invite the actually, I don't even think this is aiming high at all, honestly, because most complete count committees are perfectly happy to uplift the events that people are having in their neighborhood to promote the census. And so I'll go ahead and invite the Houston in Action Complete Count Committee. So I would invite my co-hosts. Again, probably want to send them a Facebook message beforehand, send them an email beforehand, let them know what you're doing, let them know that you would love to have their help in promoting your Ask Me Anything. Maybe give them a teaser for some of the information that you're going to cover. You're going to walk through the hard to count map. You're going to kind of take questions about the census, and you're going to motivate people to get to this certain number, challenge the neighborhood to get to this certain number by the end of the month. While you're at it, you might also want to schedule a follow-up event for the end of the month. It's going to be, how did we do in our Heights challenge to respond to the census, right? Yada, yada, yada. Keywords, get creative with this. Neighborhood, census challenge, 2020 census, yada, yada, yada. You can say this is a kid-friendly event if you were designing your event. And I probably should have led with this early on, and I intended to in the back of my mind, but that hour can be pretty painful if no one's showing up. And so what we would probably do is, have in the can some content that you could be prepared to share out, since there's probably not going to be some huge influx of questions. Who knows? There may be if you spend enough time promoting it and have the right partners. But I would look to the Texas Counts Weekly Update as a really good model because you can give some general information about where we are in the census. In this scenario, are going to be looking at some of the CUNY hard to count self-response data. And then you might just throw in something fun, who knows? Or you might crowdsource some questions beforehand that you can already be prepared to answer. But we won't get too carried away in our dream scenario here. Now, we talked about this a little bit last week in our live event kind of planning. I remember there was someone who had some very, very good questions about how you handle Facebook events. we've added our co-host. We don't really need to focus too much on our kind of ticket link or anything like that. But we definitely want to allow people to interact with our event, especially if we're trying to crowdsource some questions beforehand. And so I would change this post permission to where anyone can post. Of course, in our event description, we probably would have put in, please ask us, any questions beforehand, and we'll tackle them live on air. And the event will be recorded, and the recording will be saved in the event for you to, so if you can't join us live, then you can always come back and see how we answered your question live on air. Who knows? I mean, it's a mixed bag. You can always, whenever it comes to this post approval option underneath that, decide that you want to approve every single post by a host or co-host. Rather, anybody who posts in the event, you have to approve before it shows up. I think for the purposes of kind of advertising, and because you never really know who you're going to reach exactly whenever you're advertising, then you probably do want to check this box. But I would definitely allow people to ask you questions about your event on Messenger. That may be a good way for you to kind of start filling up the bank of questions while you are planning and promoting your event. So setting up an event on Facebook is about as easy as that. So I am going to very briefly publish this event so that we can continue along with this demonstration. And you'll see that from here, Facebook really wants you to do some advertising. And so, from the moment you, make this event live, you're going to get something like this that says Boost Event. Now, there's a couple of different ways you can do Facebook advertising. I think boosting is probably boosting is not even, I think, boosting is definitely the easiest way to get an ad going. But you could always do that directly through the ad account manager, which we talk about in our part 3. For those of us, since, it seems like we've only really done kind of one Facebook campaign or none, I think that we really want to focus on this boost event or boost post sort of deal, because it's just the easiest thing. And as a matter of fact, I realize I just accidentally invited all of those people whenever I just wanted to do that for purposes of demonstration. So I'm going to edit really quickly. I also meant to mention this early on, but I'm going to take all of the questions in the last 15 or 10 minutes, depending on what kind of time we have left after talking about the advertising portion of this. But for now, I just want to make sure I'm not confusing all of these people by inviting them to this dummy event. Fortunately, I could probably reach out to all those people and explain that myself. So we're gonna hit this boost event button. We're designing a hyper-local event. And so just because we're promoting the event here right now doesn't mean that we can't kind of change out some of the artwork. And so let's just pretend that I'm really happy with this art and I don't have anything better. One thing that I'm gonna pop into the slides and that seeing the Houston in Action Committee just reminded me of is I realized, and we thought we might cover it in the course of this webinar series, but there just didn't seem to be enough demand. But I realized that coming up with artwork for your event can be a bit of a barrier or challenge. I know at some point, if you follow the typical kind of national census resources and organizations who we all follow, then you may have come across the suggestion to use Canva, and we love that suggestion. Houston in Action last week hosted a Canva webinar, very similar to the kind of training that we're doing here today, that walked you through creating artwork for your events, for your website, for your e-blast using Canva. But you would be, surprised quite how much work in the census or in census outreach is being done on Canva to come up with artwork. So let's just say that we have oh, and I wanted to show this too, actually. There's a reason I pulled that up. But let's just say that we've created something either in Canva or if we know any graphic designers, have some within our organization. But for the purposes of getting your event approved, then you want to make sure you don't have too much text in your artwork. Now, you have to have some sort of image for your event. Let's just say in this scenario, since we want to make it super local and make sure that we're drawing in people from within the neighborhood, neighborhood, then there's no reason that we can't use kind of a neighborhood stock photo or something like that. But Facebook, it will, in the process of reviewing your ad, let you know if you have too much text in your ad. If there's anything you want to say, you can say it in the description of the event. So don't worry too much about that. Now, Facebook is automatically going to pull in the event description whenever it comes to advertising the event, but you can also override that at this point. You don't want it to be too terribly long, and you could even use something like a video. Let's say I recorded a video of myself, and you would drop that down here and kind of upload your video. You could have a video that's basically saying everything that I wanted to say in the description. Hi, I'm Aaron with Texas Counts. I wanted to challenge my neighbors in the Houston Heights to get to 60% self-response by the end of May. Did you know that now it's easier than ever, yada, yada, yada. And then use that video to promote my event. That video is something that you could just record directly onto your Facebook page. I just think with something like this, the more relational, the better. Also, if you want a good example of kind of how this is working for a complete count committee or an organization, I'm so excited to share in this week's newsletter. And if you go to our website now, you can see a video recap of this week's weekly update. The Austin Asian Complete Count Committee has done a really amazing job of kind of tying all of this sort of stuff together. And they very swiftly made that pivot to digital. They're doing some Facebook advertising. And one of the things that they have used heavily is the social kind of testimonials that they're using in a messaging app called WeChat, which is popular among Asian Americans, and on their social media, why people should respond to the census. And so if you have something like that going on any of your social media, you could even use one of those videos to promote your event. But just know the different ways that you can draw attention. I will say video is a great way to stand out whenever it comes to your advertising on Facebook, or even the events you're trying to promote without having to spend any advertising dollars. Just before I forget, because I don't think we've had opportunity to cover this in any of our other kind of webinars, but whenever you upload a video to Facebook, if you're recording one or you've recorded it elsewhere and you're uploading it onto Facebook, there is the option to very quickly add subtitles to your video. Gosh, and the more I talk about Facebook and Facebook advertising, the more I just want to make sure that we have another training scheduled to cover precisely that, because it just gets so detailed. But for now, let's just keep it simple and say that we're going to promote our event using this very wonky wide image. Now, you'll notice that the reason that image has to have so much kind of dead space is because it does resize, and I happen to have an ad blocker on right now, which is making things complicated for us. Then it does resize as you're kind of viewing it across different devices, and Facebook gives you a pretty good preview of that. So now let's get to the point where we want to make this a hyper-local ad, make sure that it's getting as much exposure as possible to the people who we want to reach and challenge. So the census, everybody should be counted, so we don't want to restrict it too much. I want to make sure that we're getting as much exposure as possible. So I'm going to say all genders, all ages. And I am going to drill this down to Houston Heights, Texas. And the other kind of option, and we cover this in our Facebook advertising thing, is because Facebook isn't the smartest whenever it comes to knowing neighborhood boundaries or anything like that, alternately what I might do, so this map should look a little familiar. Remember, whenever I was looking at that self-response data, then I looked at a boundary that was basically I-10, 20th Street. This street is called Studewood, and this is called North Shepherd, and drop a pin exactly where I want to go. And so we can eliminate this Houston Heights deal. And if I draw it down to just 1 mile, will you look at that? This 1 mile radius is exactly that area that I wanted to target with those hyperlocal, real-time self-response numbers for my challenge. So hyperlocal, 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 right? Trusted messenger, trusted messenger, trusted messenger. Because this applies to everybody, then I'm not going to, go and add in all of the targeting about, demographics or interests, language, language, anything like that, there's no reason you can't. Revisit our, part 3 and stay tuned for more kind of Facebook training that we'll do. We can help you brainstorm, reach out to us. We'll help you design a targeted campaign where you might draw in and leverage some of these demographics, interests, and behaviors. But for right now, we just want to reach as many people as possible in this area. So I've established my hyperlocal message. I have put out an event where I can start to build interest. And now I will, just assume that I'm defining my audience right here. Because this event takes place up until or on the 15th, and I want to advertise up until the 15th, there's really no magic or science to why Facebook is suggesting this $12 budget for me right now. So let's just say I want to spend 20 bucks a day. I'm going to end up spending, 150, 160 bucks once this ad gets approved. Facebook is telling me that's going to reach about 130 to 380 people per day. And that's fine, why not? As you play around with those, then you'll see how those numbers kind of grow. And then in addition to the number of people you're reaching, the budget that you set also determines kind of the audience or the impressions that you're getting in front of that audience. But this makes sense that this is a low reach because there's only so many Facebook users within a mile radius of where I'm located, right? Yada, yada, yada. Go back to our previous Facebook advertising webinar and we'll talk about what all this means, ad account, things that you need to do for that ad account, blah, blah, blah. But if I wanted to start boosting this event today, I would just hit that button. Facebook would start reviewing my ad and it would be going. So what would we do is I'm going to cancel this ad because I'm not going to actually do it right now. It would be promoting this event. We would have had a description in there saying that we have a challenge, and as people are, seeing the ad, then you'll see these numbers of people who are interested right in the middle of the screen will grow and grow and grow. One thing that I would do to make the most of this event is, post every day little factoids about the census, maybe put in, there's so much great census messaging out there. And so as you get toolkits and get some tips from the Texas Counts newsletter, different kind of resources that you can share, I would share them in the event just to kind of make sure that it stays top of mind for people. I would remind people this is a virtual event. We're going to be answering questions specific to your neighborhood about the census. There's no such thing as a bad census question, all that sort of stuff. I might post some screenshots of where we are today from the hard to count map, anything that's going to help people realize that this definitely applies to them. I would share it onto my page by hitting that share button. I would share it onto my personal timeline. Our wonderful participant from last week who was asking questions about event was talking about how he just standardly kind of shares it out on his personal page. The census applies to everybody, and so whether you have 40 friends on Facebook or whether you have 5,000 friends on Facebook, which is the maximum, then the census applies to most every single one of your friends. And so no reason you shouldn't share it on your timeline. And from there, it's just promote, 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 right? The last thing that I wanted to show you, and that will leave us about 10, that'll leave us about 10 minutes for questions, is, the reason we have it planned on Zoom is because, remember, we want to be able to promote this event and we want it to be a live event. There is a way that you could schedule the event, schedule the live stream. And there's basically two ways that you could set this up is you could go live without having a kind of pre-planned Zoom, but then that means that whenever you're out emailing the events, then you would really just be promoting the event itself. Because we know that people are really using Zoom, there's no reason you can't do both, promote your event and promote the Zoom, because people are just part of the Zoom universe and used to registering for Zooms, and we get those great reminders and everything. But there's really no reason that you can't just natively go live in the event. I will say that by clicking this live video button is kind of what I'm talking about. But I will say that for the most part, I have found Zoom to be much more reliable for live events, but I have encountered some pitfalls whenever it comes to using live video on Facebook. And just because we're more used to Zoom these days, I would just kind of say, do the Zoom, go live. linked in the slides you'll get as a follow-up to this. And if you just go kind of watch the YouTube video from last week's Pivoting to Digital webinar, then you will see that I actually walked us through exactly the steps for whenever you're live, how to finally share your live Zoom feed into this event, so that anybody who has expressed that they're interested, anybody who said that they're going, will be notified not only of the event, but the fact that you're live from your page in the event answering questions, right? We also covered some best practices just about having a live event like this. You want to have a virtual event buddy, somebody who's watching the comments for you. And then I know that I said that was the last thing I was going to cover, but this is pretty new and it just popped into my head. You'll see in the Texas Counts newsletter this week, we are promoting the fact that the Census Counts campaign has an events page now, and you can go and let's say you plan your event and you just want to get it as much exposure as possible. You can go and add your event here on the Census Counts kind of national events hub. I'm zooming in a little bit to see if they have added our weekly update since I submitted that the other day. Where are we? Austin is where I put it. So they haven't added our, because it had to have an address. Okay, I won't harp on that, but apparently it takes more than 24 hours to get your event added to the Census Counts national event mapping tool. But just know that there are many, many ways that you can promote your event in addition to the Facebook advertising that we're doing. So I am going to refer back to our slides just to make sure that we have covered everything that I set out to cover. Before I start taking questions, we talked about the Houston Heights. These slides include scheduling event the hard way. We cover some going live kind of best practices and some other tools. It's not like Zoom and Facebook are the only ways you can do it. Of course, we've talked about Instagram. Last week, we talked a little about StreamYard, which is great, but it doesn't really apply to what we're doing in this case because we want to, we're planning a virtual event and it doesn't allow you to stream into your Facebook events. We talk about YouTube. I give you links to getting started with Facebook advertising since we went over it at a very high level today and in the past. These are having to do with Facebook advertising and our in our Part 3 webinar. I did want to spend some time talking about Nextdoor, but we just don't have time. I would refer you back to that Part 4 of our webinar series, but basically all I was going to cover was taking that same Facebook event that we just created and then going and adding that as an event in Nextdoor. I really do enjoy our Part 4 webinar around Nextdoor because it's such an underutilized tool and we've seen the Census Bureau using it more. We've heard from some Census champions who are using it more. But there's no reason you can't go and promote this in Nextdoor too. Most any neighbor can add an event, or you could just post about it in Nextdoor and let people know in your neighborhood that you're doing a hyper-locally focused event to discuss the census. Okay, we definitely don't have time to cover Reach app today because I want to leave a couple of minutes for questions. So Aaron, yes.
Hey. We've got a question, and if you go into the question box now,
Sure.
you can see that it's actually, first of all, an appreciation of this webinar, but also for a little more information about Nextdoor. And I let them know we'd be answering it, and it took it out of the live question box.
Okay, perfect. So then we do have time to talk about Nextdoor because that is going to be answering one of our questions. So here's how I would close the loop here. And a lot of, kind of what we're covering today, you have to lay some groundwork first. And so again, referring back to that Part 4 webinar, then we gave you kind of a primer on Nextdoor and getting set up if you had never used it in quite this way before. And so it's not like you can go and get up and running on Nextdoor and start promoting an event same day. And so what I would do do is make sure that I'm one in Nextdoor for the area that I want to be promoting my events in. Now, know that you will also need to, oh, I want a sign-in code. Know that you will need to spend some time getting set up in your own neighborhood. Nextdoor, they're all about legitimacy and making sure that the people who are communicating in the neighborhood actually live there. And so there's a couple of ways that you gain access. And if you want to promote your event outside of an area that you're allowed to post in and share information for, again, you'll need a Nextdoor buddy. And so one of the reasons that I made sure that we focused on my neighborhood is so that we can make sure that, you know, we're looking at the same area on Nextdoor. And so what I can do now is go to Facebook, get my event link, and I would just post the event link in Nextdoor talking about exactly what I'm doing. I want to make sure I unfollow that person. That was a candidate for office. So, oh, Facebook doesn't want me to forget about boosting my events. But sorry, Facebook, not going to spend that money in this case because it's a dummy event. So what I would do is share the event. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I only have to share it in Facebook. I can also get the link. Oh, that was silly of me to do, because I can just click in the events and grab the link from here. And again, there's a couple of ways that I could do this. I could set it up as a separate event in Nextdoor, and there's really, you know, no contraindication to doing that. Or I could just set it up as a message to my neighbors. So I would just say same thing. Hey, I'm hosting, oh, that's silly. Live, ask me anything about the census, Heights Challenge. Now, the limitation of Nextdoor is that, you know, messaging and events and this poll feature is less popular, but it's kind of fun. And posting into groups, you're really kind of limited there. Nextdoor is not the kind of social media that has video, live events integration, anything like that. And so really what you would be doing is promoting the live aspect of the event on another platform. So I would describe your event. I'm having a census response challenge for our neighbors because I noticed we are lagging behind our 2010 self-response rate. Now, again, we've talked about before how Nextdoor can be a very sensitive place. And so here's one of those times where I might throw in something to concede that, yes, I understand we're all in the midst of this pandemic. I really hope everybody is safe. I really hope that everybody is happy, healthy, provided for, because Nextdoor is a lovely place to get yelled at for the tiniest miscommunication or the tiniest misstep, just because it just brings out the ornery side in people and the curmudgeonly side of people. And so here's kind of one of those places where I might add in that personal touch. You know, hope everybody's fine, but I also wanted to make sure that we are paying attention to the census, because that's very important, because it allows our local elected officials to be able to adequately respond for public health crises like COVID-19, something like that. But then, after we get that out of the way, then I would just paste my Facebook event link and let everybody know that, you know, whatever, I'm having this event on next Friday, and you can go and RSVP for a reminder that I'll be going live. If you have any questions beforehand, just send me a message on Nextdoor or email me, and I'll be happy to answer that question live. In case you don't join for the live event, then I will have the event recorded that you can kind of see how I answer your question and how we're doing. I'll be having a follow-up event at the end of the month to see how well we did at the end of our Heights Challenge. So in this case, yeah, I'd probably just do it as an event. People can, same thing, express interest about the event and, you know, kind of post questions inside of it and all that sort of stuff. So that is how I would immediately go and start promoting on Nextdoor in this case. Okay, what other questions do we have? Oh, and also in part 4 of our webinar, we talk about using the messaging aspect of, let's see. Oh, Mariana's asking too. What about individually reaching out to our neighbors house by house and Nextdoor to check if they have any census questions? Ah, Mariana, great question. So what I would do then is, let's go back into Nextdoor. Mariana, the way you do that is you go directories, neighbors, and whenever you're in the directory, then you can see the street that people are on, but you can't really necessarily see the block. And so I really haven't been able to decide probably the most strategic way to do this other than reach out to people on my own street. So what I know is that if you look at the map on the right-hand side, then that isn't even the, full kind of, it's kind of a sliver of my neighborhood. And so there's 8,000 people total in my neighborhood, and what I can reach through my kind of Nextdoor slice is 4,000 people. And so I could, here's Aaron, I could go and just start finding people who are only on my street because this is, at the end of the day, this directory is 4,000 people. And so I think that's probably the most sustainable way. And so it might work if you do something like a block captain scenario where you with some friends who or neighbors who are also in your slice of your neighborhood, whatever Nextdoor is calling that, you say, hey, I'm going to take neighbors A through F, and I'm going to do all the neighbors A through F, or I'm going to do A through M, and I'm only going to do the ones on my street of Columbia Street, something like that. But whenever you send a message, then you just click the message thing right next to them. And we gave some examples in our Nextdoor webinar of some kind of copy and paste messaging you might want to do. And I would just kind of copy and paste that message right into here. Okie dokie. So we are right at 5 o'clock, and I don't see any other questions at this time. And so I think that we can go ahead and wrap this up. Thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, please stay tuned for other trainings from Texas Counts. I know that we sped through a lot of this information today, and so chances are you'll want to come and rewatch this video. We'll be sharing this video out for people who weren't able to make it today too, so that it can get their wheels turning. But at the end of the day, Texas Counts is here to help you. Reach out to us individually. We love these kind of brain buster questions and kind of individualized questions to help you with specific strategies. Our goal is not always to provide these high-level overviews. It's to start a conversation, get some ideas going, so that we can be your partner all along the way of pivoting to digital and planning virtual events and just getting out the count in general. So thank you all so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks.